Dude, we are so dialed in right now. Basically, what has just happened is Blizzard has released a post saying the War Within Dungeons and Affix update, 4 new affixes, Reckless, Thorned, Attuned, and Focused. And I haven't had a chance to read this post yet, and so I want to record a YouTube video where we go through this together and see what's in store. Greetings, the War Within beta is now underway. We're excited to share some additional updates regarding dungeons and the Affix system. Heroic and Mythic dungeons. In Dragonflight Season 4, we experimented with our existing dungeon difficulty progression to offer additional in-game options for players who joined more methodical dungeon gameplay. This update to dungeon difficulty progression is also an opportunity for players who enjoy Mythic Keystones to have a place to build mastery over dungeons before the pressures of a timer kick in. You can read more about those changes here. We plan to do or continue this model of progression of the War Within with some exciting updates. Just starting off, I think that the update to how the dungeon levels has been received has been largely positive. I don't really see too many negatives, just on the whole. It also kind of shifts down how players are, interacting with the dungeons, where before, the dungeon levels spanned between, 2 and 35, and that just makes it a lot harder to get into dungeons that are appropriate to your skill level. Now, with it only spanning from, 2 to 20, that will allow players to more frequently have dungeons that are around their skill level. On top of that, you get really good loot from dungeons that don't have 3 affixes, and so it feels like it's a lot more gradual progression. But in general, I think that the dungeon difficulty change, for most players, it didn't impact them at all, and for some players that it did impact, it was largely good. Normal, difficulty is unchanged. This difficulty always includes our 8 War Within dungeons, okay? So basically what they've stated that they're going to be looking to do in the future is make M0 dungeons change with the seasonal dungeons, as opposed to just being like the 8 Dragonflight dungeons and having them be in a state where they become obsolete. So they're looking to change that. I'm interested in seeing what they're saying now. Heroic, the tuning and rewards of this difficulty are increasing to be equivalent to baseline M0 in the past of dungeons of the previous system. New mechanics and other adjustments from Mythic will not be present in this difficulty. This remains a queuable experience. Starting with the Season 1 of the War Within, Heroic dungeon difficulty will feature our roster of seasonal dungeons. Okay, so it's going to continue to allow you to generally progress through, and whenever you're progressing through this dungeon experience, you're going to, just in general, be able to see the seasonal dungeons and learn the mechanics. For Mythic, the tuning and rewards of this difficulty are increasing to be the equivalent of a +10 dungeon with affixes in the previous system, similar to what we saw in Season 4. There are no timers, affixes, or limitations on changing specializations while in the dungeons. The goal is to create a mega dungeon-like effect for this experience. Starting with Season 1 of the War Within, Mythic dungeon difficulty will feature all roster seasonal dungeons, kind of like what I was saying before. Oh, okay. Mythic dungeon difficulty will be unavailable until the War Within Season 1 begins. How does that work for Heroic? So Heroic is going to be all 8 War Within dungeons on launch, be the equivalent of baseline M0. It's queuable, though. Okay. So basically, the expansion launch is going to look like you're going to be queuing Heroic dungeons to try to get as much gear as you reasonably can, fill out all of your slots, and now M0 week is kind of dead. Doing it two rounds of M0s is kind of dead. But now this, M0 difficulty will be unavailable until War Within Season 1 begins, and now Mythic difficulty will have a daily lockout, changed from a weekly lockout in the previous system. That's cool. Again, this is another thing that I think that players who, I would say, aren't ready to do M+, whether it be due to skill, whether it be due to anxieties or social pressures or whatever, them jumping into M0 is honestly a pretty good thing, and changing this to a daily lockout makes sense with, honestly, just how M+ works. M+ is a weird situation where it's uncapped, and so, okay. Overall, nothing bad. We already knew the dungeons: Stone Vault, Dawnbreaker, Arakara, City of Threads. I've only been able to do the dungeons on normal. I don't really have too many opinions on these yet. As these are available for M+ testing, I'm going to create more videos talking about how I feel about the pool, but I don't really have any thoughts generally right now. I've only been doing them on normal, and normal doesn't give you a good representation of how the dungeons are going to feel. The M+ Keystone system will carry forward from Dragonflight Season 4 with updates to the position of the affixes in the system and updated affix buckets. The M+ system will have rewards up to level 10 with +2 starting for what would have been an 11 in the past. A 5 should be as hard as a 15, and 10 should be hard as a 20 in the previous static system. We intend to better align rewards and difficulty increases in the M+ system by updating the introduction points of affixes in Season 1 War Within. Oh, okay, so they're actually changing where you're getting affixes. +2 is Fortified Tyrannical. +4 is a new set of passive affixes. +7 is Bursting, Bolstering, etc. Is this what these are? Is that what the passive affixes are? Dungeon rating should be equivalent to what they represent in the current system. Okay. There should be a smaller range of keystone levels to find groups for, meaning more meaningful progression between each level. I am down with this. I think that this makes sense. All right, before we dive into the specifics of the new affixes, we would like to outline our goals and the purpose of these affixes that these affixes serve. Our overarching goal is to minimize the mechanical overlap between affixes and dungeon trash design in the current +4 affix bucket. We aim to achieve this through a more passive approach, focusing on the following objectives. Honestly, this probably is fine. I think that, you know, Afflicted and Incorporeal were a bit too much. In a lot of situations, I think they were a bit tough, and so yeah, having them be a more passive approach, you know, it makes sense. Like, not all the time can a healer actually dispel in an M+ dungeon. We're going to shift the source of the challenge to the dungeon itself by simplifying affix design and emphasizing current creatures' abilities. I think this is good. I think that the fact that they're setting this as a design goal is very good. Reduce visual noise, nameplate clutter, and the cognitive load on players during trash combat. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of issues with how many mechanics trash has, and VFX is actually a big part of this, where it's like really hard to see some mechanics sometimes. Allow for very context-specific gameplay decisions depending on the dungeon they're applied to. I have no idea what the hell this means. Context-specific. Are they talking about, like, I don't even know what this would mean. Oh, I have my evoker dispel because I can't dispel here. I don't really know. I'm interested in seeing what this even means. Additionally, these affixes will include a positive effect. Oh, wow, interesting. The aim of these positive effects is to highlight different damage types each week, allowing specialization. Additional opportunities to excel during the season. Oh, good God. These effects should feel like a bonus, offering an advantage for different damage profiles each week without being essential to complete a dungeon. Oh, good God. Players will have an opportunity to flex towards different talent gearing options. Oh God, I'm gonna keep reading. What does this mean? Reckless non-boss enemies without mana ignore 20% armor with their attacks, but their armor is reduced by 30%, and they take 10% increased arcane damage. Non-boss enemies without mana, dude. Oh my God, without mana. You think I could tell the difference between mana, rage, energy on bosses? I feel like I can't tell the difference between mana and just like general resource on a boss. With their attacks, with their armor is reduced by 30%. That's wild. Okay. Non-boss enemies without mana inflict physical damage to their attackers when attacked, but take 10% increased holy and take 10% increased holy and shadow damage. Non-boss enemies with mana inflict 20% increased magic damage, but take 10% increased nature damage and 30% damage from bleed effects. Focused, non-boss enemies with mana have 30% increased haste, but take 10% increased frost and fire damage. Wow. Wow. Let me keep reading before I say what I think. Note that these tooltips indicate whether the affix applies to creatures with or without mana. These affixes will not affect every creature. With our new passive affix bucket set to replace the current +4 affix bucket, the following affixes will be retired from the War Within: Afflicted, Incorporeal, Entangling, Storming, and Volcanic. Okay, this is fine to retire these. To match the number of affixes in our level 4 bucket to align with our affix goals in the War Within, we'll be retiring Spiteful for Season 1. Okay, that's nice. In the level 7 bucket, it will include the following: Raging, Bolstering, Bursting, Sanguine. We're still experimenting with how these affixes will fit in our updates. We believe that the changes will offer a refreshing experience for players at all levels each season, and how to redefine how the M+ system influences dungeon gameplay. We look forward to your feedback and discussion on these topics, and we'll see you in dungeons. All right, so snap reaction. I'm not a huge fan. Let me just think about this a bit more. First and foremost, it's a bit difficult, I think, at a glance to tell who's got mana, who doesn't have mana. You know, what are non-boss enemies with mana, what are non-boss enemies without mana. The fact that it will vary what mobs are actually affected by these affixes on a per week basis comes off as a bit odd. I'm glad that it's affecting non-boss enemies first and foremost. I think that that's actually a pretty good change. Dude, like non-boss enemies without mana, non-boss enemies with mana, like I'm gonna really struggle to be able to tell who's taking increased damage from what. On top of that, the fact that you're going from like some weeks where, okay, so a lot of these are tank based, right? So non-boss enemies with mana have 30% increased haste, non-boss enemies with mana inflict 20% increased magic damage. By the way, 30% increased haste means that the cast is going to be happening faster, so this means that things like Curse of Tongues and Numbing Poison are just going to be more important, right? It's going to be annoying. But a lot of these are just, you know, non-boss enemies with mana inflict 20% increased magic damage. A lot of one-shots in dungeons are already magic damage hits, and so a 20% increase to magic damage dealt from mobs like this is maybe a bit tough. But on top of that, any bolt that contacts your tank with a 20% increased magic damage buff is probably going to kill them, especially if you're, you know, then compounding it with like bolstering or something like that. So that's not only to mention the fact that I think that unique damage types. So this is the same issue in my mind that Incorporeal and Afflicted had, where there are the haves and the have-nots with the Incorporeal and the Afflicted system, where it's not like you don't feel better whenever 1 week comes around where you're doing 10% bonus damage. You feel fucking terrible for the other 3 weeks where you're not dealing 10% increased damage, right? That's or 30% increase from bleeds too. Like I'm rerolling Feral, I guess. Like, but anyways, it's like, so say you play an Arcane Mage. Whenever Reckless comes around, you know that you're going to do 10% increased damage. This is sick. However, whenever Thorn's around, you're doing 0% increased damage, and you're like, well, this sucks. Whenever Attuned comes around, you're doing 0% increased damage. This sucks. Whenever, you know, Focus comes around, you're doing 0% increased damage. I guess I'm playing Frost Mage or Fire Mage for this week. That sucks, especially if you just wanted to play Arcane, or say Arcane is like the best spec. I don't think that this actually, oh god, I don't know. I mean, I guess it. Okay, so I think it does do this thing where it like reduces. It allows for very context-specific gameplay decisions depending on the dungeons they're applying to. But like, dude, I don't think that. Oh god, it doesn't work like that. Specs in Mythic Plus deal 30% more damage than other specializations, and it's not something as simple as, oh yeah, you do 10% increased damage this week. It's like a Shadow Priest right now does 30%, 35% more damage than a Mage, and so it's like, oh okay, the Mage is doing 10% more damage this week, but the Shadow Priest is still doing 35% more or 25% more damage now. All right, doesn't really. There's no decision that's being made in that regard. I don't know. Reduces visual noise, nameplate clutter, and the cognitive load on players during trash combat. I feel like the fact that I wouldn't be able to tell what mobs are affected by these affixes just at a glance is like a problem. Yeah, I'm a hater. I don't love this. I guess I'm interested in testing it to feel it out. I don't love being just like overtly negative off the rip. I feel like in general, I try to avoid being very negative on things that I haven't tested. I don't think this is the route that I would have gone. I do think them experimenting with Kiss Curse affixes is solid. And I think that Blizzard continuing to experiment with affix is actually good and healthy for the game in the future. So there's a lot of things that I'm actually excited for and I'm actually happy about. I'm not in love with these changes to the affixes, though, and what these affixes are. Yeah. Anyways, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts down in the comment section below. I'll be back after I'm able to test these and kind of give a bit more concrete thoughts. But yeah, I don't know. Like this non-boss enemies with mana inflict 20% increase in magic damage. Dude, I can think of so many mobs that are like... Can you imagine, dude, the Invokers in Algathar Academy, how they randomly will cast missiles on players? That does 20% increased damage. That's going from hitting you for 70% of your health per tick to 100 to zeroing you. Like I think it's going to be a bit rough. Anyways, I don't want to drag this out any longer. I'm just kind of like trying to really think of the ramifications of all this. Goodbye, everybody.